The things that influence me when I make a photograph are partially some of my own ideas, partially the things I find. I leave a lot of my work to chance. I usually find my models by chance, my locations by chance, and the objects that I put together. For some reason, I just like that quality in my work. It makes it more spontaneous. So part of it is that chance location. Part of it also is that I go to museums, and especially the Museum of Natural History, and I look at a lot of primitive folk art, and a lot of my ideas come from that kind of folk primitive sculpture and rituals and ceremonies has always influenced me.
How would you define yourself? Somebody said, well, okay, nobody knows who Arthur Tress is. You find somebody, you're out in Nebraska. They come up and they say, oh, you say Arthur Tress, I'm a photographer. And say, what kind of photography do you do? What kind of a photographer are you? If you had to define yourself.
I usually say surrealist. That's kind of a shorthand. I don't really... A surrealist takes things out of their natural context and places them, people or objects, in a different milieu. And you get a kind of a dissonance, kind of a strange vibration. And that, to me, is the kind of photographer I've been over the years. Also, there's a kind of symbolic, a hidden symbolism behind the photograph, which is, I never try to articulate it. There's always kind of a poetic ambiguity in the pictures. And I think that's what I'm trying to get. And also, I like my photographs to be slightly shocking, but in the sense that what you're presenting is either so wonderful or amazing or horrible that it kind of takes the person's breath away. It gives them a punch in the stomach. And there's a kind of mischievousness in that. And that's part of my way of working also.
How do you get that kind of feedback? I mean, do you go to your openings and watch people look at the photographs, or just when people come over here and look at them? How do you know that's happening? I mean, I can tell you it happens, but I don't know how you know that it happens.
I think mostly myself. After I've spent an evening printing and I dry the prints in the morning, and then I look at my own prints and I say to myself, that's amazing, did I do that? I mean, where did that really strange, violent, extreme image came from? And if it has that kind of quality of suspended animation, I'm very pleased with it. And I know it's sort of successful.
Choosing the medium of photography, does that add a little bit more to the mystery because people look at a photograph and assume that it's real?
Yes, both. The reason I do this in photography, photography has a wonderful kind of stillness about it, but also it has a wonderful documentary quality in that these things can't be real, and yet they're real because there's all this heavy texture of dirt and decay, and that gives it a kind of reality to the material. And so photography really is wonderful to capture that. And yet it's very detached from these objects. It's almost like someone has made a record of these things that were found and forgotten about. And even my pictures of people, there's always a sense of kind of grave stillness about them. And so they're kind of trapped in a kind of anguish of this very suffocating space without air. And when the Hasselblad mirror pops up, it's almost like a guillotine making this kind of noise. Photography is a very kind of, has a lot to do with death, even though you would think that it would normally be capturing life. It does really, it sort of freezes in a kind of almost mummifying, mausoleum kind of way, what you're photographing. And I try to emphasize that by spatially, I always have my objects or people with a lot of space around them, so that the image always becomes very self-contained, like a little self-contained box. It's like where the objects kind of just rest, or the people are sort of frozen into this tableau, and they're kind of trapped in it. And there's always a little hint of escape somewhere. Maybe there's some sky in the background. If you sit on the beach during the summer at Coney Island, and you see this sort of, it has at night, and it kind of has a wonderful glow. It's kind of like the dreams of the world, people escaping from the realities of real life, and creating this kind of fantasy world, but at the same time an escape, and yet at the same time this escape is in a process of decay and dissolution, giving it even kind of a further kind of romantic aura. And then just to sort of grow up in this atmosphere was also during that period of, I remember when I was 12, 13, of nuclear, it was just when they were doing a lot of publicity about the nuclear testing. You would always see things on television of the nuclear tests in Nevada. And I think that had a great effect on me. For even the work I'm doing now has several of those themes. It's a kind of fascination with catastrophe. And while, of course, I'm against nuclear devastation, I'm at the same time honestly fascinated by it. That whole idea, it's so apocalyptic, and it's sort of wonderful, and just awe-inspiring. As they say, war is terribly photogenic. And so, so I think that's also one of my themes. And I was thinking the other day, I was sitting out in the woods just on Saturday, and getting a little depressed because of the autumn leaves, even though they were so beautiful. But you admire the beauty of change, but change is also death. And I think that's why I like that theme of what would seem to be death in my photographs is the awe that we have in change. But that's the thought. I will write that down in my notebook and promptly forget about it. But an interesting aspect of my work, the way it's been presented to the public, I had been living in Sweden, working for the Ethnographical Museum. I had studied painting for about 3 or 4 years at a Bard college. And then I began traveling around the world, and I got very interested in primitive tribes. And I began those were my first photographs. I photographed the Eskimos and the Toda people and tribes in Africa. And then when I came back to the United States, I was commissioned by the Smithsonian Museum to do an exhibition called Appalachia People and Places, where I traveled around to Appalachia collecting folk objects, brooms and weavings and Appalachia toys. But at the same time, as I traveled around Appalachia, I noticed that all these people were living in terrible poverty, mostly because of the strip mining. So I photographed that less picturesque aspect of the culture. And I would contrast a traditional Appalachia couple with a scene of devastation and the effects of strip mining, which were destroying that culture. And then I actually almost did a kind of a James Agee kind of thing, where I interviewed the people. This was the kind of thing that I had done when I was a folklorist, going to different primitive tribes and recording. But this, I was recording the dying Appalachian culture. And actually, this photograph of the child looking out the window is almost kind of a Dorothea Lange, but it was just amazing to see that these people were still living in the same ways as they had been living in the 30s. And I think that sense of reality, and this is a kind of a dark picture, still pervades my work. The New York State Council on the Arts did an interesting experiment. They produced a small portfolio that was to be distributed to the New York City public schools. They made 5,000 of these boxes, and I wrote a text about, it was about ecology in the city and how you could find open spaces where you could make parks and the problems of the urban environment. And this was a collection of 50 pictures that I had done. I also began photographing children in the city, kids hanging around the dumps, the pollution of the rivers, kids swimming under the bridges, the way the waterfront could be used for recreational purposes but never was. But while I was doing this project, the photographs became more and more strange. Somehow to show that strange pollution, I had to use more extreme images instead of the cliched stereotype images that people no longer had reactions to. So I had to find new inventive ways of expressing these kind of propagandistic ideas. And so the photographs became more and more surrealistic. And I think it's at that time that I began finding my own style. And about 3 years later, that became the book called The Dream Collector. And it's a book of 60 children's dreams. And I used kind of the techniques that I had used when I was a folklorist. I would go to playgrounds with a tape recorder and ask children their dreams. And so the book begins with birth dreams, a child coming out of a bunch of empty eggs, the face in the water, suffocation. And I used some of the urban photographs that I had, being in an empty room, grandmothers and relatives from the past coming to haunt you, sort of authority figures. And I wanted to cover every aspect of the dream experience. And so it wasn't merely just a photographic book of my own best photographs. It was kind of an actual collection of all, as I say, different aspects of the dream experience as remembered from childhood. And this opened up a whole new way of working. This was in Newark, in a burnt-out area, that combined that sort of social conscious documentary with elements that made the picture go beyond that specific social use. It also tied into a lot of the primitive themes that I had found when I was the primitive rituals, because in a way dreams are the primitive remnants in modern man. When I finished doing the book, The Dream Collector, I wanted to stay with that theme of dreams and the primitive. At that time in the 70s, a lot of books came out about the shamanistic experience, which was dream hallucinations of primitive people,